My name is Sloane Mercer, and I'm 30 years old. And on a Friday evening in June, I drove 2 hours to the beach house my family had been spending summers in since before I could walk, and found a new lock on the door, and my Aunt Carol standing on the wraparound porch with the specific expression of a woman who has made a decision and is prepared to explain it. I want to tell you about the beach house first, because it matters for the story to have its full weight. The house was on the North Carolina coast, a four-bedroom with a wraparound porch and an outdoor shower and a kitchen that faced the water, and that had the specific, comfortable, worn-in quality of a house that has been loved by the same family for 30 years. My grandmother, Dorothy, had bought the property in the early 90s, when the coast was less developed and the prices reflected that. She had renovated the house twice and maintained it carefully, and had used it as the gathering place for the family across 3 decades of summers and holidays and the ordinary occasions that become the texture of a family's shared life. Dorothy died 4 years ago. When she died, my family had treated the beach house as a shared family asset, managed collectively by my Aunt Carol, who lived closest to it and who had the specific organizational energy of a woman who treats management as authority. The management had worked in the loose, informal way that shared family assets work when everyone is getting along, and nobody has examined the underlying structure too carefully. I had not examined it. I had come to the beach house every summer and for Thanksgiving most years, and I had contributed to maintenance costs when asked, and had otherwise lived my life in Charlotte, where I worked as a land use consultant for a firm that handled coastal development projects. The irony of my profession is something I am going to get to. When Carol stood on the porch that Friday evening and explained the family's decision, she was organized and clear in the way she was organized and clear about everything. She said the family had reviewed how the beach house was being used and had determined that the current arrangement was unequal. She said some family members were contributing significantly more than others in terms of maintenance costs and upkeep and availability for property management. She said she and my cousins had decided to formalize the arrangement and that going forward, access to the house would be allocated based on proportional contribution. She said she was sorry, but she hoped I understood. I listened to the complete explanation. I did not interrupt. I asked one question when she was finished. I asked whether anyone in the family had recently reviewed the land records for the property. Carol looked at me with the specific expression of a person who does not understand why a question is being asked and is slightly irritated by its apparent irrelevance. She said, "What does that have to do with anything?" I said, "Quite a bit, actually." I got back in my car. I drove to a hotel 20 minutes down the coast. I called my colleague Daniel, who handled title searches for our firm, and I asked him to run a complete title history on the beach house property first thing Monday morning. Then I sat with what I already half knew and tried to figure out how much of it was true. I need to explain what I half knew, because the half-knowing is important for understanding why I had not acted on it before the Friday with the new lock. 8 years ago, when I was 22 and had just finished my undergraduate degree and was about to start a master's program in land use planning, my grandmother had called me to the beach house for a weekend visit that felt different from the usual visits, in a way I registered but did not examine closely at the time. Dorothy was specific and purposeful about the things she did, and the visit had the quality of something arranged rather than casual, but I had attributed that to the general quality Dorothy brought to everything. We had spent the Saturday on the porch, and she had talked about the property in the way she sometimes did, tracing its history and what it had meant to her and what she hoped it would mean going forward. She had asked me about my studies, and I had told her about land use and title law and coastal property structures, and she had listened with the particular focused attention of a person who was hearing confirmation of something they had already been thinking about. On Sunday morning before I left, she had asked me to sit with her at the kitchen table, and she had placed a document in front of me. It was several pages, and I looked at it, and she said, "I want you to understand what this is." I said, "It looks like a deed amendment." she said. It is. She said, I am transferring the land parcel to you, not the house, the lot. I want you to have it. I was 22 years old, and I had just started learning about property law in an academic context, and I did not fully understand the implications of what she was telling me. I understood that she was giving me something. I understood that it was a meaningful gesture. I did not fully understand what it meant for the house that sat on the land, or for the family members who believed they had a stake in both. Dorothy had me sign the acceptance documents. She said she had already spoken to her attorney and the transfer was being recorded with the county. She said she wanted me to know it was there. She said, "You will understand why this matters someday." I said, okay, and I thanked her, and I drove back to school and I filed the copy of the documents she gave me in a folder in my desk, and I thought about it occasionally over the following years without ever pulling the folder out and reading it carefully. When Dorothy died 4 years ago, the family had gone through her estate through a probate process that covered the beach house as a structure and the personal property inside it and various financial accounts. Nobody, including me, had pulled the land records to check whether the lot the beach house sat on was part of Dorothy's estate or whether it had already been transferred to someone else 8 years prior. The probate attorney had worked from Dorothy's will, which referenced the beach house as a structure to be shared among family members. The will had not referenced the land because the land was no longer Dorothy's to reference. It had already been transferred to me. The attorney had not flagged the discrepancy because nobody had asked her to look for one, and the land records had not been part of the materials she was working from. My family had spent 4 years managing a beach house that sat on land none of them owned. Daniel called me Monday morning before 9. I was on my second cup of coffee in the hotel when my phone rang, and he said, "Sloane, this is interesting." Daniel has been doing title searches for 12 years, and interesting from Daniel means something specific, which is that the record does not say what the person who hired him expected it to say. He told me what the title search showed. The land parcel, identified by the lot number and legal description of the coastal property, had been transferred from Dorothy Mercer to Sloane Mercer 8 years ago by deed recorded with the county recorder. The transfer was clean and properly executed and had been recorded within the required time frame. There were no liens, no competing claims, no questions about the validity of the transfer. The land was mine, had been mine for 8 years. The county record said so and had been saying so uninterrupted since the recording date. The house was a different question. The house, as a structure, had been referenced in Dorothy's will, and the family had inherited interests in it through the probate process. But a house without the land it stands on is not a freestanding asset in any practical sense. A house owner who does not own the land has what is called a tenancy of sufferance in most jurisdictions, meaning they occupy the land at the discretion of the landowner. In this case, the landowner was me, had been me for 8 years. I said, "Daniel, what does this mean practically?" He said, "It means that the people in the house are technically occupying your land without a lease or any formal agreement with you." He said, "It means the new lock on the door is not something they had the authority to change without your knowledge, because the door sits on your land." He said, "Sloane, you should talk to a real estate attorney today." The attorney was a woman named Margaret Holloway, who practiced coastal property law in the area, and who had the measured, confident manner of someone who has seen complicated family property situations many times and who has a clear framework for understanding them. I met with Margaret Monday afternoon. She reviewed Daniel's title search and the copy of the transfer documents I had photographed and emailed to her. She said, "Your ownership of the land is clear and unencumbered." She said, "The family's interest in the house structure creates a complicated overlay, but your land ownership gives you significant leverage in any conversation about how this property is managed going forward." She said, "What would you like the outcome to be?" I thought about that question for longer than I thought I would need to. Not because I did not have feelings about Carol standing on the porch on Friday evening, explaining why I needed to be managed out of the arrangement. I had feelings about that, But feelings about what had been done and clarity about what I actually wanted were two different things, and I needed the second before I could do anything useful with the first. I told Margaret I wanted three things. I wanted an honest conversation with my family that included the full picture of the property's title structure. I wanted a formal agreement about how the property would be used going forward that reflected my actual position as the landowner, and I wanted the lock changed back. Margaret said those were reasonable things to want. She said she would prepare a letter. The letter went to Carol, and to my mother, and to the two cousins who had been involved in the lock changing on behalf of the family as a whole. It was a formal letter from Margaret's office on firm letterhead that explained the title situation clearly and without judgment, presenting the facts of the land transfer and what they meant for the family's assumed ownership structure, and inviting the family to a conversation about how to move forward. Carol called me before she had finished reading the letter. I know this because the call came in while I was in a meeting, and when I called her back, she said she had questions, and I said I was sure she did, and I suggested she read the letter in full before we talked, and that we schedule a call for the following evening after everyone had had time to process what they were reading. She did not like that suggestion. Carol processes things by talking them out immediately in the specific, rapid way of people who are most comfortable moving quickly and who find deliberate pauses in a process frustrating. I said, Carol, this is complicated information, and we will have a better conversation if everyone has had 24 hours with it. She said, fine, in the tone that means the opposite. The family call was Tuesday evening. My mother was on it, and Carol, and my cousin Tyler, who had been the one to physically change the lock and who was the quietest participant on the call by a significant margin. My other cousin, Brianna, was on it, and was, to her credit, the first person to say something that reflected an actual attempt to understand the situation rather than to manage the response to it. Brianna said, "So Grandma gave you the land 8 years ago and none of us knew?" I said, "I knew in the sense that she showed me the documents and had me sign them. I did not fully understand what it meant at 22, and I did not think to look at it again until Friday." She said, "And the house is on the land?" I said, "Yes." She said, "And we spent 4 years managing the house like it was ours?" I said, "Yes." Brianna said, "Grandma really thought this through, didn't she?" I said, "She did." She said, "Why did she do it this way?" I said, "I think she knew the house was going to become a source of family conflict at some point, and she wanted there to be clarity about who had ultimate authority over the property, without creating that conflict while she was alive." Brianna said, "So she created the conflict after she died." I said, "She created the resolution after she died. Those are different things." Carol was less philosophical about it. Carol said the transfer should be examined by an independent attorney because she wanted to understand whether it was properly executed. I said that was her right and that Margaret's information was available to any attorney she chose to retain. I said I was confident in the validity of the transfer because the county recorder had been confident in it for 8 years. My mother was the most complicated presence on the call. She was quiet for most of it, and when she spoke, she said, "Sloane, I wish you had told us sooner." I said, "Mom, I wish I had understood it sooner. That is the honest answer. At 22, I did not fully grasp what Grandma had done. By the time I understood it more clearly, the family had been managing the house for 4 years on a different assumption, and correcting that assumption felt like a confrontation I was not sure was necessary. What happened Friday made it necessary." My mother was quiet again. Then she said, "Your grandmother always knew what she was doing." I said, "Yes, she always did." The agreement took 6 weeks to finalize. Margaret handled the drafting with input from Carol's attorney, who, after reviewing the title documents, confirmed everything Margaret had said about the validity of the transfer and the implications for the family's assumed ownership structure. The agreement addressed three things. First, it formally acknowledged my ownership of the land parcel and established a ground lease arrangement under which the family members who held interests in the house structure could continue to use the property under terms that recognized my land ownership. Second, it established a governance structure for the beach house that included me as a primary decision-maker on matters affecting the property as a whole, with input from other family members on scheduling and maintenance decisions. Third, it set a fair market ground lease rate that the family's shared house account would pay annually, which was modest, but it was the principle of the thing, rather than the amount. Carol negotiated hard on the governance provisions. Carol negotiates hard on everything. Margaret was patient and clear, and we arrived at language that worked. By the end of the process, Carol and I had been through enough back and forth that we had developed a working relationship that was more honest than anything we had had before, which was not what either of us would have predicted at the start, but which was the outcome of two organized people having to be precise with each other for 6 weeks. Tyler apologized. He came to me separately from the family call and said he had changed the lock and had not thought about it carefully enough, and he was sorry. I said, "Tyler, I appreciate that." I said, "The lock is changed back and we can move forward." He said, "I should have asked more questions before I did it." I said, "Yes." I said, "We all had questions we should have asked earlier about this property." He nodded. That was the end of it. The first summer under the new agreement was different from previous summers in the specific way that things are different when the underlying structure has been made visible and everyone is operating from accurate information rather than assumptions that had been running unchallenged for years. We were more formal about scheduling. We were clearer about who was responsible for what. We had conversations about the property that we had never had before because we had never had to, and the conversations were better for having been necessary. Dorothy's photograph is still in the kitchen of the beach house, on the shelf above the window that looks out at the water, where it has been for as long as I can remember. It is a photograph of her on the porch in the early years of the house when she was in her 40s and the house was newer, and she is looking at the camera with the specific expression of a woman who had done something she is satisfied with. I look at that photograph differently now than I did before June. Before June, it was a family photograph. After June, it is also a record of intention. She is standing on the porch of a house she had built on land she had already decided what to do with. She is looking at the camera with the expression of a woman who had a plan and was executing it. The plan was going to outlast her because she had made it in a document and filed it with the county and handed me a copy and said, "You will understand why this matters someday." I am a land use consultant. I spend my professional life working with coastal property law and title structures and the specific legal architecture of who owns what and what that ownership means. I should have understood it sooner. I did not. I understood it on a Friday evening in June when a lock did not work and my aunt was on a porch explaining a decision that was based on an assumption that the county records had been contradicting for 8 years. I'm glad I understand it now. I'm glad Carol changed the lock. Not because I would have chosen that sequence, because without that specific Friday, I might have held that folder in my desk for another decade without opening it, and the clarity it produced, while it came in an uncomfortable form, was the right clarity at the right time. Dorothy knew that too. I'm certain of it. She knew the land would matter when it mattered, and she put my name on it, and she said, "You will understand someday." And she was right. She was always right. That is my story. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop your city in the comments. Hit subscribe. I will see you in the next one.